Good morning. It's Sunday the 14th of June, and my video today is sort of like a sermon, a little bit shorter than I might preach in church, but wanted to reflect specifically, as I do on Sundays, on the passage that's our appointed for today. And in the Gospels today, we read from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 9, beginning right at the end of the chapter, a few verses into chapter 10. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and curing every disease and every sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." Then Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits, to cast them out and to cure every disease and every sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First Simon, also known as Peter, and his brother Andrew. James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Philip and Bartholomew. Thomas and Matthew the tax collector. James, son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus. Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Go nowhere among the Gentiles, and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You received without payment. Give without payment. The passage goes on. Jesus tells them to not to take with them all kinds of provisions, money and extra clothing, and to become radically dependent on the people that they're going to share this message with. Now, it's quite a job description. Raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, heal the sick. Off you go. Come back and report back in a couple of days. Well, it's also easy just to think, well, of course Jesus gave them the power to do that, so they just went off and did it. But it's one to ponder, it's one to think about, and it's one to ask how it applies to our life today. So the government have decided that as of tomorrow, places of worship can be open for private prayer. The Methodist Church has decided across the whole of our church that we will wait until after our annual conference at the end of June to make any kind of decision about that, and make any kind of provision really. And some places have already chosen as individual churches or as circuits, groups of churches across a geographical area, chosen to say that they won't do anything, won't open at all until the 4th of September. Or until September at least. I said the 4th because the 4th of July was the government's initial kind of target. They've just moved that forward by 3 weeks. And there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of conversation about when we get back into our buildings and what we do in our buildings and whether we sing and how we do that, and all of that is good and well. This season of not being in our buildings has given us, if we've paid attention to it, a lot of good things to chew on. And one of those is what our buildings are for, and what we do in them, and what we expect from them, and what God actually fundamentally expects of us, or asks of us, or invites us into, or all three. The gospel is challenging, it's demanding, it leaves no part of our life unavailable to God. It asks of us to give, in a sense, everything of ourselves and what we have to the good of all that God believes to be good. And that's tough. So today, as we read that passage, we read about Jesus, in a sense, sending his disciples out to go and begin to embody, to talk about, to demonstrate, to show not just so much the power of God, because obviously if people are being raised from the dead and healed from the sickness, you'll pay attention. But beyond that, for them to move out of this kind of huddle of Jesus and his disciples, to move out of what has become maybe not comfortable, but certainly familiar for them, and to see what lies beyond. Our Methodist Church nationally has a blog on its website, and just 2 days ago, the blog was written by Jude Levermore. Jude is a good friend of mine who I've worked with on a few national church projects and in the Methodist Church more widely. But Jude is head of mission for the Methodist Church. She's a remarkable woman, and I have enormous time and respect for her. She's a really lovely, funny woman as well, who doesn't take herself too seriously, which is always a good sign for me. Jude, at one point in her life, in a previous kind of incarnation, was director of the Greenbelt Festival. She's an amazing woman. She wrote this: "The Spirit might be asking us to be brave, to not cling to the old, but to be the pilgrim people of the moment." When Methodism changed from a connection of societies to become a denominational church, we began to erect and use separate Methodist buildings, which became our churches. Methodism came first. Our buildings came second. As we begin to think about going back into our buildings, I'm hopeful that we will take time to consider what we've learned from being out of them. I'm hopeful that we will have solidified our understanding that church is not a building. We teach that to our children, but do we hold that in our hearts? We, the people, are the church, the body of Christ meeting together in community, acting together in mission, longing together for the transformation of our world, responding together to our calling. I'm praying that as we share a roadmap for leaving lockdown, with all its needful risk assessments and procedures, we will guard against entering another lockdown, that of being so caught up in our buildings that we miss the opportunities to be church without them. Anecdotally, I've seen and heard of such amazing innovation and creativity over these last months, as churches seek to serve their neighborhoods and be good news and speak good news. All around the connection, new and wonderful things are springing up. As our managing trustees consider carefully their next steps, my hope is that they carve out time not only to navigate a way through 29 pages of risk assessment, but to first undertake a spiritual assessment. To what is God calling this church? To what is God calling this chapel? I believe the Spirit might be asking us to be brave, to not cling to the old, but to be the pilgrim people of the moment. Let's be a people of vision. Let's not long to get back to normal. Let's see what God might do if we allow ourselves to be led somewhere new. Let us be generous and gracious to one another. Allow different churches and chapels to make the decisions they need to, without pressure to get on with the usual, allowing instead time to consider the Spirit. I'm reminded of Charles Wesley's powerful Pentecost hymn. Jesus, confirm my heart's desire, to work and speak and think for thee. Still let me guard thy holy fire, and still stir up the gift in me. So let us guard the holy fire, and guard our buildings only as a means of that. Let us keep walking the way together, bearing the burden of grief for all that and those which and who have been lost, in love for one another and in service to our world. Let us guard the holy fire, and guard our buildings only as a means of that. Powerful words from someone who I think has a lot to say to our church and is part of an amazing leadership team that we have. So as I arrived into Haxby Wigginton just on 3 years ago, the church was in the middle of a major building project, which has cost well over £500,000. And we're not far off paying that off. We were lucky in terms of getting grants. We had a fantastic team of people writing up applications to help us to get a lot of money from sources other than our own pockets, which has been a huge blessing. And the building is much more navigable. It's much more bright. It makes more sense. It's more welcoming. We have more creative spaces to use. But I guess I'm left with a question. Having not known the church well before I came, a little but not well, has over £500,000 changed the church? And I don't mean the building, I mean the people. Or did we spend a lot of money in Haxby Wigginton to change the building, believing that that is changing the church? That's somehow creating a more welcoming and importantly inclusive and an accessible space across the whole of the building, down to everything from the fonts we used on the signage, taking into account the easiest fonts to read for people who have reading difficulties or dyslexia. All of that is a really important piece of the work, and I love the fact that it was as considered as that and as far-reaching as that. But has it fundamentally changed who we are? Or how has it moved us on? Because it should have done that at least. I leave that question maybe for a wider conversation, and another conversation as part of our church reframing itself into the future. What I do know is that this season of coronavirus has as sad and as awful as it's been in so many directions, it has yielded up some treasures. And those treasures have been the opportunity to experiment with meeting online, to explore that, to discover the joy of that, the intimacy of that, getting to know each other in little breakout rooms, in our Zoom meetings, better than we might have done over coffee after the service on a Sunday. That it's almost been a far more intentional experience of church and gathering to be church in that particular form. That is what we would do in what we'd call worship on a Sunday or on a Wednesday. I told the story elsewhere, but I'm reminded again and again of a conversation I had standing behind a desk at a sixth form open day at the University of York when I was on the chaplaincy team. And a man coming across for a chat because his daughter, I think, said to him, "Just push off, Dad. I'll do this bit by myself." And he was an Anglican, and he'd come from I forget where, doesn't really matter. And he was just talking about church, and we chatted a bit, and he said that a few years before, their church had been essentially condemned. That I think the roof was failing, and they wouldn't be able to move back in until hundreds of thousands of pounds were spent on that. They didn't have that. And so they decided that the first thing to do would be just to move out because it was safe, and that was the safe thing to do, and they had to. And they started meeting for their church gathering in the local primary school hall or some other community facility. And how over the course of a couple of years of trying to fundraise to fix the roof, they actually ran out of steam. Not because they ran out of money, but because they ran out of their desire to go back into an old, cold, strictured building with wooden pews facing in a certain direction, a narrow aisle, a building that had actually become the focus of the community's life in an unhelpful way. That the church's life was about maintaining, caring for, looking after the building. Many people are attributed to have said this first, but the phrase that goes, "We shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us," is never more true than when we talk about churches. Because we decide to construct them along the priorities that we have, most of which have to do with gathering occasionally to do things that the gospel doesn't seem to include in the list of first things to do. Singing and joining in an act of worship towards God when the gospel is really much more about getting down into the dirt of our local communities and more widely, and doing the work of justice and peace and healing and reconciliation and care and love in a costly way. Of course, those gatherings serve that purpose because they help us, when we use them well, to gather to remember who we are and what we're about. But so much of the church's energy, so much of the wider church's finance and structure and organization is about essentially serving the building. Jesus asks the disciples to go and do something deeply uncomfortable. The story isn't really written that way. We don't see their kind of doubt or struggle in that. They go out, they literally heal the sick, raise the dead. You know, they do all the stuff that's there. They come back, they're amazed, and it's all part of, and I use this word kindly, the propaganda of the gospel writer wanting us to know, firstly, that Jesus is who he says he is, the disciples are who they say they are, and that we can trust where we've got to because of what they did back then. But it must have been terrifying. It must have been deeply uncomfortable at the very least. There's something very powerful about this season, this time, where we really have to ask what the church is about. Is it about trying to coordinate and organize worship online and making sure that there are papers distributed to people who want to sing a hymn quietly by themselves at home because they can't get out? Is it about that? Is it about that first? Is it about that as a priority? Is it about making sure that we care for our own as best we can? We can't do very much, can we? We can't outside of that. But as we think about coming back into our buildings, whether that's next week or next month or in a few months' time, whenever normal arrives again, it won't be like it was before. And I hope and pray that in our church's life we can be wise enough to leave lots of space for the new things that have emerged, or for the possibility of things we may not yet have thought about, seen, experienced, or tried. Because if we don't, what we will do is we will fill our life again with all of the things we've already been doing and struggling to find enough people to help us to do. And that will require of us some wisdom, some courage, and as Jude put it, some grace. We'll need to be generous and gracious to one another, to allow different churches and chapels within our own church's life, to allow us to make decisions without the pressure to get on with the usual, allowing instead time to consider the Spirit. We are not called to be in acts of worship in a building that is ours. If that helps us, if that helps us to know who we are and what we're about, all good and well. But let's be careful that we don't continue, or maybe just reinvent in some way, that as a priority, that as our understanding of the first thing that God asks of us when God asks us to become followers of Jesus. That we don't think that because we know that and we know how to do that, and so there's a mixture of comfort and confidence in wanting to go back to that. That's what matters most. We've been through Easter, the bewilderment of that. We've been through the ascension. Again, the disciples being left to work it out and discover God in themselves. We've been through Pentecost. We've been through that enormous call upon their lives to give their lives in some way. The finding of the truth of church in other people's languages. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and watch my sermons from those Sundays. All of these string together into a very challenging, for me, never mind for you. I hope they're challenging for you, because I've been deeply challenged by the readings through this time, by the season we're in. Through Pentecost and the church finding its voice in other people's languages. Through last week's question of what it means to make disciples, to be disciples, and how we might subvert that into what is comfortable, known, or convenient. This whole time, whether our churches are open tomorrow or not, of whatever flavor or denomination or even other faith groups, whatever each decides, our buildings are only as useful as they are in serving the values within the Christian tradition of the gospel of Jesus Christ and the kingdom of God as a place of justice, a place of peace, a place of welcome, a place of inclusion, a place of forgiveness, a place of healing, a place of real relationship, a place of the work of growing up together. I will never get tired of saying those things, and I hope you won't get tired of hearing them, because I remind myself as I say those things of what it means for me to think of myself as a minister in the Methodist Church in the UK, part of a global family of Christian churches who are working out all over again what our buildings are for and what they serve, and let's be honest, what they get in the way of, and how we might most wisely approach them as we begin to tentatively think about reopening them in some form. Of course it will be good to be in the same room together. Of course it will be good to drink a cup of tea. Of course it will be good in time to be able to hug each other, those of us who do hugs and those of us who want to be hugged. Of course it will. There is an intimacy that is about being face to face in a room where we can see, touch, hear, even smell each other. That isn't to be found across computer screens. But who will we be? And what will it mean for us right now to hear Jesus say to us, I want you to go out. I want you to leave me. The place that you know and the place that is familiar to you, however challenging you found it, I want you to go out and trust each other and trust the people you'll be with and find ways of engaging with this story in other people's stories. And that will always be hard for us. Much harder than working out what kind of music we sing at which service or what time those should be. All the other things that so often seem to take so much of our energy. God doesn't ask us to be particularly organized. God doesn't ask us to have grand plans. God doesn't ask us to do big risk assessments. God asks us to trust God's heart, and to trust each other's, and to trust our own, and to take those as a starting place, to hold hands and walk together into our buildings, out of our buildings, as part of being God's family, God's children in the world. So Jude says again, I'm praying that as we share a roadmap for leaving lockdown with all its needful risk assessments and procedures, we will guard against entering another lockdown. That of being so caught up in our buildings that we miss the opportunities to be churches without them. So let us be generous and gracious to one another. Let us be generous and gracious to one another. Let us guard the holy fire and guard our buildings only as a means of that. So loving God bless us as we reflect on being sent out, even though we can't go out, on what it means for us to be church and become church again. And perhaps become church again in a whole new incarnation, holding on to some of the familiar, exploring some of the new, having the courage to risk together, trust each other, and believe that you are with us in all of it. In Jesus' name, amen.